Hi everyone, welcome to this new video. This is about power. And so we talked last time quite extensively about polarity and how the distribution of power in the system, in the international system. And as part of that, we discussed what is power, and particularly what does Waltz think power is. What we're going to do today is sort of broaden that definition a little bit. That's probably not quite accurate. What we're going to do is we're going to look at power from a few different, the perspective of two or three perhaps different realists. What we should see from that is that there should be some overlap and some similarities, some sort of familiarity already. You should be watching this and thinking, oh yeah, we talked about this as a sort of a means to power for nation states. You should see that, but you should also see like the sort of nuanced differences between theorists. And the idea really is to, again, sort of reinforce what you know about power and to sort of show you, look, like realism really is a cohesive theory within, or a cohesive approach to international relations that has this idea of power. And although different theorists might sort of differ around the edges, there is some sort of an agreement, at least a rough agreement on what power is and how to measure it. So that's the goal for today. We're gonna make sure I get the slides working for us this time. Oopsie daisy. All right. Which will involve me both starting the slideshow from the beginning and sharing the screen. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay. All right. So I think we're sharing now. Polarity in Germany. Oh, that's actually not that's last times. It's not what we want this time. We want this one. Here we are. All right, so you should be seeing that now. Realists and power. We're going to look at Morgenthau, Waltz, and Mearsheimer. We looked at Waltz last time. He's back in, but he's sort of compared with these other two realists. The first one being Morgenthau. Morgenthau, as is probably true about classical realism generally. Classical realism, compared to neorealism of Waltz and then Mearsheimer, classical realism is going to be much more nuanced, much more fiddly. It's going to go into much more detail, and that's interesting. So Morgenthau does that. He starts talking about geography, and in particular, right, there's these sort of three aspects of geography. I think when we looked at it last time, when we looked at Waltz was like, okay, how big is your country? Okay, well that's a brute measure, right? That's a very broad stroke measure, because what's your country made of? Poland, for example. Poland's a fairly big country by European standards, right? Not by sort of Russia, United States, India, China standards, but by European standards, Poland has quite a lot of territory and a decent sized population as well. But the thing with Poland is it's flat, and it's sort of sandwiched between Russia and Germany, which is not the best place to be. Anyway. And Morgenthau really speaks to that, right? Classical realism really like gets down and dirty in these details. It says, look, what's your country made up of, and what surrounds it? And when I say what surrounds it, I mean, like, is it surrounded by water? So in particular, the United States and the United Kingdom, as I think we've mentioned maybe once or twice, I've hinted at this, but the fact that they are surrounded, more or less by water. I say more or less, I know the United States not, it has land borders with Canada and Mexico, but it has, in terms of separating it from Europe and from East Asia, so two vast oceans, right? That increases its power. Well, it does two things. It stops other armies getting easily to the United States. Right? That's a big endeavor to cross the Atlantic with an army, not only to have the sort of transport ships necessary to transport large numbers of men, right? Hundreds of thousands of fighters. You've also got to, all the equipment, think of tanks transporting across the Atlantic or the Pacific. And then also, think of keeping those supplied across the vast ocean, right? So that's a big deal. That's not nothing. Similarly for the United Kingdom, right? Okay, maybe the distance, the water that you have to travel to get from the continent, let's say France, to England is, you know, it's 25 miles or something in its smallest point. The fact is that that's not trivial, right? That does something to the power of the country. Defensively, it helps, but of course, you know, alternatively, like if the United States wants to invade China, the Pacific Ocean's a big hurdle, and of course it has, well, which is why it has bases in Japan and in the Philippines, right? But also, I mean, even those maybe are not enough, right, to invade China. So the supply lines across the Pacific would be tricky. Mountains, right? Similarly, these are features that are difficult to cross. It slows down armies. It inhibits, you know, certain kinds of vehicles, perhaps, and equipment being transported easily across them. And so Italy and Spain are good examples in that Italy has the Alps right around the north of it that sort of keep it in some ways insulated from land attacks from you know, from France, let's say, or from you know, Central Europe or Eastern Europe. Similarly, Spain, right? It's on that nice sort of, it's on the Iberian Peninsula there, right, where it's divided by these mountains from France, and so, you know, it's not that it's impossible, right? And of course, Napoleon has a campaign there in Spain and in Portugal, but it's, you know, it's complicated, right, by the mountains. That adds to the power of Spain and of Italy. Well, and then ultimately as well, territory size, right? The Soviet Union is very large, says Morgenthau. And that does something, right? Because if you're going to conquer the Soviet Union, or if you're going to put them out of a war, you know, it's one thing to get to Moscow. It's not easy to get to Moscow, but once you're in Moscow, okay, you know, that's a big victory. But there's all this other territory, right? That you know, you can put forces in, you know, that can maybe even support parts of the Soviet army. So, you know, in order to defeat them, completely defeat them, you got to take all that territory, and that's a lot of territory, as opposed to, let's say, let's not go too extreme, but let's say, you know, if you compare the Soviet Union with, let's say, Hungary, right? You know, there's only so much land in Hungary, and so, you know, you need fewer forces to occupy and to, you know, prevent any sort of insurgency, any sort of remainder of the army that you've supposedly defeated, to prevent them from finding support and finding like safe places to equip themselves and to sort of hide out or to launch attacks from. It's harder to do that in Hungary or than it would be in the Soviet Union. So that's a part of it as well. Natural resources, we talked about them. Morgenthau goes into quite some detail here. He talks about food. Germany and the UK in particular, when those guys get into wars like the First and Second World War, food can be an issue. They don't produce enough food for their populations. They have to import it, and so that's tricky. On the other hand, Russia and the United States, they, you know, probably partly due to the land and the arable land, but they can fully support themselves with food, so there's no need to import it. So, you know, if your supply lines get cut off in a war, that's a bigger deal for Germany and the UK than it is for Russia and the USA. Raw materials. This is sort of, we talked about it last time really, but of course, but Morgenthau is interested in that as well. He thinks these are the most important, back in 1936 at least, these were the most important elements to have, and you know, who has them. Here's a map of the proven oil reserves, right? Oil's a big deal. Everything moves on oil. You've got, you know, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia have a lot of oil, and Russia has a fair amount of oil too, Libya. This is sort of similar to what I did in the last lecture in terms of who has the power. I've got industrial capacity, right, is another one. We didn't really talk about this with Waltz, to be honest with you. We did talk about steel production, which might be a good proxy for this actually, but But you've got to have factories, right, that can produce things like arms. If you're in a war, ships, heavy ships, tanks, aircraft, missiles, bullets, small arms. You've got to have an industrial base to be able to do that. And so here we are. We can see the industrial capacity of the different states, and we can do the same as last time. Say, well, China, the United States, Japan, Germany. United Kingdom and France are down there as well. India. Anyway, there's something else, right, called military preparedness. So it's not just about having a big military. It's not just having. It's not just the size of the military. It's also how prepared they are. And so part of that is technology. And so Morgenthau goes into the history of it. This is something as well that really distinguishes classical realism from neo-realism. It's like, Morgenthau is prepared to go quite far back into history. Remember when Waltz, on the last video, where Waltz has that map of like the sort of the chart of it goes back to 1700. Morgenthau is going all the way back to the Middle Ages, where he's talking about the switch from like this sort of feudal system or from like aristocratic, armies being sort of rooted in cavalry, in mounted in knights, right? And then the switch from that to sort of harnessing commoners who, and commoners typically, right, they're infantry because they can't afford the horses, or they don't have the land to keep horses, and so they don't have horses and don't train with horses. They just have like a spear or something like that, right? And they use that in a battle. But that, in some cases, in that case in particular, I suppose, in those two battles, the Swiss infantry routed the feudal cavalry. And then later on, Charles VIII, right, with artillery and infantry, smashed the Italian city-states that I think maybe depended a bit more on the cavalry at that point. And then, of course, in the 20th century, so you got these advances in technology, which can also help. Probably I don't need to dwell too much on that, right? I probably wouldn't need to convince anybody with the nuclear weapons versus, knights or something like this. It's a fairly clear picture, but think about some of the things that are happening in terms of developing technologies these days. Think of the supersonic missiles that are being developed. Also, missile defense systems have been important recently. So leadership is in there as well. So we've had technology, we've got leadership. He contrasts the great strategic thinking of Napoleon versus the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line which was set up to keep the Germans out, along the German border. But that's no good if the Germans come through the Low Countries, come through the Netherlands and Belgium, and just bypass the line altogether, right? So that wasn't the best sort of thinking. So strategic thinking comes into it. Again, this is about sort of understanding that realism, especially classical realism, has this. There's a lot of things to look at. It looks at a lot of things. Neo-realism, not so much. Waltz, not so much in the way of looking at different ideas. Leadership, so we've had leadership. Quantity and quality of armed forces, which I think we dealt with as well last time. Remember, we went on that website and it tells you like, how many aircraft do these guys have? How many aircraft carriers? How many men under arms? What's the sort of the military availability in that country, right? But men and women between a certain age, right, who could take up arms. That's that quantity and quality of armed forces. Population, a large population, says Morgenthau, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's one thing having a big country, but it gives you maybe a lot of potential, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can turn that into military power. And that's something that sometimes people say about China, perhaps, right? That if you look at their population, it's huge, but until fairly recently, and probably still up to some point right now, the technology that they're able to equip those people with, means that they wouldn't be, sure to defeat the United States in a war or something like that. And so he talks about this, about the migration to the United States between 1874 and 1924. That's responsible for the large US population, right, which again is necessary but not sufficient for power. France and Germany were actually bigger than the United States in 1870. So that he's saying like this makes a big difference, right? This sort of change in the balance in terms of population has led, in the case of the United States, to them increasing their power vis-a-vis their European former rivals, I suppose. This is one of the most interesting things, I think, that Morgenthau does. He talks about this thing called national character as well, right? So, it really does, if we're talking about classical realism, this really, like, it gets into the weeds. It talks about things that are, in some ways, I think surprising things, right? This idea of a national character. And so he goes through a few of the nations and he sort of explains the national character. He doesn't spend a lot of time doing it, but he says, look, this impacts the amount of power that they have. So the fact that they are, Russia has this, it's elementary force and persistence. And so that feeds into the power. The fact that they just keep going, America, individual initiative and inventiveness, right? We in the United States, or, the national character of the United States is, we take the initiative, we try novel things, we invent stuff, we're inventive, as opposed to the Russians that just push and push and push. The British, of which I guess I'm a product, have this undogmatic common sense. And then the Germans have the thoroughness and the discipline. And all this, including as well as the intelligence and morality of a nation, affect the power, its own power. So you could be a realist and you could write a study about national character, right? And you can say, well, look, Morgenthau told me this is a part of power, of national power, and so I'm going to investigate the national character and see, can we really discern a national character? Can we differentiate between these different nations? And can we sort of measure and decide how much the power is increased or decreased depending on the national character? What characteristics, I suppose, of a nation increase power, which ones decrease the power? And if you did that, and anybody said, oh, this is not realistic enough, you say, well, actually look at more. I got the idea from Morgenthau, right? And then they can't really say that anymore. So anyway, interesting. But again, the important point is, like, this is very different from neo-realism. Ken Waltz wouldn't be going anywhere near this, I don't think. National morale as well, right? How what success we've had in the past, how we're feeling, right? I mean, very, very fine, very subjective things that are difficult to measure. It's one thing counting how many soldiers you've got. It's another thing trying to measure national morale. And this is what makes the measurement difficult, right? This is how, if we're trying to predict who's going to win in a war, well, how do we account for national morale? What does it look like? And how do we go about taking that into account? Quality of government, similarly, right? Although Waltz has that competence, doesn't he? So that would sort of fit in with that a little bit. Quality of diplomacy as well. That's part of the power. I remember for Morgenthau in particular, once you're having a war, once you're fighting, international politics is sort of finished. Something else is happening at that point. And so it makes sense that like, diplomacy would be more the focus. That, it's one thing objectively having the power. It's the second thing to like be able to measure what that power is. But this diplomacy thing, it allows you to sort of present the facts about your power and your intentions in a way that can increase that power, or perhaps diminish it a little bit. You wouldn't usually want to diminish it, obviously, but if you think about what's happening with Russia and the United States right now, there is an objective fact about Russian power that we could try and measure, right? And we might do a fairly good job of figuring out how much power they have, and we might be able to measure their national character and the quality of their government and the quantity and quality of their armed forces and their strategies and their technology level and their industrial base and population, the size of the territory, where the mountains are, where the seas are. We might be able to figure all that out. But that's not everything, right? There's something about the diplomacy, the tactics, the strategies. So there's the war strategies that we already covered, but there's diplomatic strategies that might also make them more or less powerful, depending on how they conduct these meetings with the United States, and then later on with NATO and OECD countries as well. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. Waltz we've done. This is, I think, a rehash, so I won't spend too long on it, but I'll just remind you, I've put the 7 things up there that he thinks. It's more, I think, for me, it's more measurable. It's more measurable, but then it's less nuanced. The only sort of weird thing is maybe like the political stability or the competence. But that's not that, it's not the same as national character there, right? National character is pretty straight. And also, like, size of territory is a lot different from like looking at the features of the territory, right? Like Morgenthau's asking us to do. Waltz wants a much more parsimonious, a much simpler, straightforward way of measuring things. And now we move to Mearsheimer, that we haven't really spoken about in his idea of power, but it's an important one. He splits it into 2 things. He says, look, there's potential power, and then there's military power. And the thing that we have to be concerned with is military power. Potential power, great. You have to have a large population, right? Which agrees with Morgenthau, right? But it's necessary, but not sufficient. If you've got a large population, well, that you can translate for Mearsheimer, you can translate that into a strong military. But you don't. But just having the people on their own, that in itself is not power. That in itself is not the power that we have to look at. That's just the potential for power. Same with wealth. Yeah, sure, you have to have economic resources to be able to invest in research and development, and to be able to build technology, or to build weapons systems and those sorts of things. Yeah, you have to have that. But having that on its own isn't power. It's potential, but it's not the thing itself. So, Japan's a very wealthy country. It has the material resources, at least the financial resources, to construct a powerful military, but it hasn't. And so right now it's not powerful. It's the potential for power, but it doesn't have power, right? The United States, on the other hand, right, it has the financial economic resources, and it has turned much of those resources into actual power, into aircraft carriers, into fighters and bombers and nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarines, nuclear submarines, everything, right? Whereas Japan hasn't done that to the same extent, at least. And that's the important thing. You can have the potential, and this slide talks about potential power, you can have that, but it's not the end. The end is military power. This is the thing. And and it's even more narrow than that for Mearsheimer. He says, no, it's the land forces. It's the army. That's the thing that matters. And the reason why that's the thing that matters is because they are the principal instrument for conquering and controlling territory. He's an offensive realist. For Mearsheimer, offense is the way to increase your power. You go and you take territory and you hold the territory. You take that from somebody else. That increases your power and decreases their power. So military power, that's what you use to do that with. That's how you control. And again, it's not just the Air Force, and it's not the Navy. It's only the Air Force and the Navy, to the extent that the Air Force and the Navy are supporting the ground forces. So yeah, the Air Force, when it's giving sort of close support to ground troops, right, that counts, that matters. The Air Force that's doing a bombing campaign in Belgrade, no, that's you don't count that. That's not important for Mearsheimer. You're never going to control territory that way. In another lecture, we'll go through his arguments about why that's not important. A bombardment bombing campaigns from the air campaigns on their own, they're not significant for nearshore, not a part of power. The potential to do them is not a part of power. Same with naval blockades. Just a naval blockade on its own, it's not been successful in the past, Mearsheimer says, and so the potential to be able to do that, that's not really power. That doesn't help you. The thing that helps you is your land forces. The Navy helps if it is transporting troops across a sea, right? Projecting those land forces, that power across seas. Yeah, sure, the Navy's important for that, but on its own, like some sort of either aircraft carrier sort of bombing campaign or a blockade or a bombardment of the coastal defenses or something like that on its own, no, that's not power. It's just the army. How many men have you got? How well are they trained? Can they move? And can they fight? And can they take territory? And can they hold territory? That's the whole of power for Mearsheimer. And so there's these checks on power, right? These things that prevent your army being able to move. One of them is these large bodies of water, which we've talked about a few times. Mearsheimer talks about the stopping power of water. We've talked about this a few times already, but let's say again, right? Let's say that Napoleon wants to invade Britain, which he undoubtedly did want to invade Britain at some points. Well, okay, he has the army that could probably do that, but the problem is that you've got to cross the sea, and if you cross the sea, well, those soldiers, the land forces on a boat, it's not the same. They're not performing the same function, right? And they're not performing, they're in some ways sitting ducks. I mean, maybe not quite, but much closer to that than they would be on a battlefield or on land. Yeah, so there's large bodies of water, that's important. Same with Hitler, right? Operation Sea Lion. After the fall of France, right? Hitler the plan was to invade Great Britain, and Operation Sea Lion was the beginning of that, and it was the realization that, look, in order to get our troops into Britain, we've got to have air and sea superiority. So we've got to take on the Royal Air Force, right? First of all, to get the air superiority, then we've got to, get on the boat, and we've got to get the soldiers across the Channel, and that was a big problem. And in fact, it failed, right? Because the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force was able to prevent the Luftwaffe from establishing air superiority. And so without air superiority, the ships, the transport ships full of German soldiers that were planned, would be vulnerable to attack from the air. And so it would be very expensive and perhaps impossible to launch it, to get enough soldiers across to have a successful invasion force. And so that's where Hitler turned his attention to the east and to Russia, where, at least on paper, right, it was more straightforward to transport soldiers across land than across the sea. Yes, I've got here then nuclear weapons, right? That changes the calculus a little bit. So some realists say that because nuclear weapons exist, and that there cannot be any war, because the idea is, well, let's just say for argument's sake now that the United States and Russia go to war over Ukraine. That seems very unlikely, but just imagine that was to happen. And let's say the United States started to win to the point where they were moving into Russia towards Moscow. Some realists will say, okay, the threat of American soldiers capturing Moscow and, like, sort of regime change, right, to some extent, like sort of wiping Russia off the map in an important way. That would lead to Russia either threatening the use of nuclear weapons or actually using them. Either way, just a threat, right? Just a threat that would prevent American forces trying anything like that, right? but if it didn't deter them from doing it, right, then we'd have a nuclear war, right? And so the argument is, because of the potentiality for nuclear war in that sort of a scenario, then we can't really have any great power wars anymore, right? And there's some evidence that gets marshaled towards that. They say, well, look, tell me a war between two nuclear-armed powers. It's hard to do that, but there is one or two, like the Kargil war between Pakistan and India is a good exception to that rule. Although even that's debatable, because you can say, well, okay, well, yeah, India and Pakistan, they went to war. It was a fairly limited war, first of all. And one of the reasons why it was fairly limited was that the Americans stepped in straight away to stop the war. It was Bill Clinton at the time. See, one of the things that Pakistan was doing is so that they're in this war with India. And the thing is, like, in terms of conventional forces, India is superior, has bigger numbers, has superior conventional forces to Pakistan. So one thing, but they both have nuclear weapons. Right? So Pakistan, one of the things that they were worried about was, okay, well, if India invade, which they might, if they capture territory, like some of this territory here, we have nuclear weapons there. So we better move them out of the way so the Indians don't get them and either destroy them or capture them or whatever. And so what they do is they have them on like mobile, they put them on these missile carrying trucks and send them out into the northwest frontier province. Well, that freaked the Americans out a little bit, because if you know about the northwest frontier provinces, that they're not very well governed, and there's a lot of sort of Taliban type and tribal sort of warlords that run the show out there. And so if you sort of putting your nuclear weapons on trucks and send them around there in the desert, well, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to keep hold of them. You could get into somebody else's hands that are maybe not best friends of the Americans, or that might be perhaps not incentivized in the same way as states are incentivized not to use them. And so Bill Clinton called them both over and put a stop to the war and told them to put their nuclear missiles back where they knew where they were, in order to avoid like them falling into the wrong hands or something. So yeah, Mearsheimer thinks that wars can still happen even with nuclear weapons. He doesn't think that it will definitely lead to nuclear war. I think you still have a conventional war, because one of the things he says is, like, he says, look at the Cold War, right? The Soviet Union and the United States had plenty of nuclear weapons that could have destroyed the world, 3 times over or whatever, but they still built up their conventional forces. They still expected that to matter. And so the fact that they still expected that to matter means that it does still matter, right? So that's his argument on that. But if you don't have nuclear weapons for Mearsheimer, then that does put you at a very big disadvantage, even if you do have a large land army. So somebody like Turkey, for example, Turkey have a very big armed army, but they don't have nuclear weapons. So that if they got into a war with Russia, which has been, they've been enemies in the past, right? Sort of a France-Britain thing going on between Turkey and Russia back in the 19th century. Well, they would be at a distinct disadvantage because of their lack of nuclear weapons. Mearsheimer acknowledges that. And then again, we talked last time about polarity. Mearsheimer thinks that unbalanced multipolarity generates the most fear. Fear leads to increasing the size of your army, which then increases the fear that the people around you are feeling, right? And the thing with multipolarity, I think he agrees with Waltz, right? That with multipolarity, there's so many different moving parts, different alliances are forming and disintegrating over here and there that you can't really calculate your position anymore, and you feel less safe and less sure about what's going to happen. I've said this already, I've made a whole slide for it, but this is the last slide. So I'll just reiterate it and then finish this, this lecture. But basically, latent power, the potential power, doesn't always lead to military power. But that's the thing that matters, military power, and land forces in particular.